period of time than an hour from their home. The establishment of new satellite dialysis clinics, Mr. Speaker, is something that certainly would require a significant amount of additional, not only financial resources, but health human resources into the system, Mr. Speaker. And as we stabilize the sites that we currently have, improve on the tertiary care site, we will be in a better position to determine where future satellites should be in the province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Tom Hewlett, Chair of the Department of Medicine at the Cape Breton District Health Authority, said in a government release, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker, as there were 2 quotes from that, "We always put a high priority on treating patients as close to home as possible." Dr. Hewlett also equates less travel and fewer expenses for our patients and families with helping to reduce the burden of illness. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister. When will this government abandon its stubborn refusal to apply the same principle to the people in Hants County who sacrificed a great deal to raise money for their own dialysis machine, and will this minister commit to coming out and explaining exactly that to these individuals?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, there are people all across the province who travel both to satellite clinics and also here into the tertiary care centre. We have a plan to improve and enhance dialysis services. We have invested several millions of dollars into making those improvements, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to make improvements and evaluate the need for services on a go-forward basis, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated, some of the money that we have invested in the tertiary center here in Halifax will allow training for home dialysis. This province does not utilize that form of dialysis anywhere close to the national average. And Mr. Speaker, we are going to work very hard to ensure that people can get dialysis service not only as close to home as possible, but where they can medically within their homes, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Premier, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has indicated that he will be introducing legislation which will make changes to lobbyist registration in our province. From all indications, these changes will leave a large loophole, specifically key party operatives such as staff in the Premier's office, ministerial aides, and caucus staff. These individuals will not be covered by any restrictions on lobbying government. But my question is, why would the Premier not include senior political staff in his changes to restrictions on lobbying in our province?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member is speculating about potential legislation. All I can say is he'll have to wait until the legislation actually comes forward.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this is an issue on the minds of Nova Scotians because we currently have the former provincial secretary of the NDP now lobbying the very government he used to work for, the NDP government for which he held the top post for 4 years. Clearly, as a person who has the ear of the Premier, the Cabinet, and top staffers within the Premier's office. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has publicly stated that Ed Wark does not have insider information, yet is the same person that the Premier dismissed over the election financing cover-up from within the NDP. Speaker, is rich for the Premier to suggest that the person who failed to return $10,000 in illegal donations to the NDP is not in a position of conflict lobbying so soon after having been dismissed for violating the Elections Act. So, Speaker, how can the Premier state that the ultimate insider would have no inside knowledge of the NDP cabinet and its staffers?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the person he's referring to never ever worked for the NDP government.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the Premier for allowing me to correct that, because Ed Wark worked for the NDP party for 4 years as their secretary, and I want to thank my leader for correcting me. It was not $10,000 that the NDP accepted in legal donations. It was $50,000 that they accepted in legal donations. The $10,000 was the fine that they were given from the Chief Electoral Officer for violating the Elections Act. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to clear that up. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect transparency in those who are lobbying government to try to obtain contracts or funding from this government. Nova Scotia was one of the first provinces to bring in a Lobbyist Registration Act, and yet today the Premier feels that someone who held the top position in the NDP party somehow does not have inside knowledge of government or of the ministers involved that he was so closely aligned with before being fired by the Premier. So my question is, will the Premier commit today to including people such as Ed Wark in any new changes to the Lobbyist Registration Act in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, lobbyist registration usually refers to people who are actually employed by government, not employed by private organizations. I want to ensure, of course, that the record is correct, and of course, in fact, Mr. Wark, I believe, resigned and was not fired. And finally, of course, the findings of the Chief Electoral Officer was that the party knew, in fact, nothing about the background to or the receipt of any money. Mr. Speaker, that is the facts.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. In response to my question yesterday regarding the HOG formula and the allocation of funds to school boards, the minister responded, and I quote, "The formula and budget considerations are two separate things." And Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more, and most people in the House would know they are two separate things. The issue, Mr. Speaker, is that the question made no reference to budget considerations. So, Mr. Speaker, for the information of all members of the House and for clarification regarding the HOG formula, I would like to quote from the department's own document which describes the formula, and it says, "The HOG formula was developed to allocate P-12 funding," and it also goes on to say, and I quote, "Whatever funds government commits to the P-12 system is what's allocated through the HOG formula." So my question to the minister is this: now that we're clear on what the HOG formula is and that it is the allocation of funding, what effect, if any, will the results of the current HOG formula review have on the allocation of funds to school boards in 2012-13?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to clarify around the formula and the budget. The budget target is, for the want of a better description, the pie, and the formula, the HOG formula, is the way you cut the pie. So the HOG formula at this time is being revised with the collaboration of all of the school boards. We're still working on that tool. The tool that will be working with the budget that we will be coming forward with. That decision has not been made. So the pie, the decision hasn't been made, and we're working on the tool to cut the pie. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know how many times we have to talk about the funding formula and the HOG formula, and you know, cutting the pie to me is allocating parts of the pie to school boards. So I think maybe we understand that the HOG formula and cutting the pie are the same thing. So, Mr. Speaker, proposed...
Yeah, we got it, Clary, thanks.
Motherhood and apple pie, right. Mr. Speaker, proposed changes to the funding formula speak to isolated schools. At Public Accounts this morning, there was a healthy discussion about the definition of isolated schools, and following my questions regarding that definition, I was keenly interested in similar questions from the member from Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley, who I know cares about small isolated schools and small isolated communities. Every board has isolated schools and communities. Every board will be impacted by the definition of the word isolated used in the formula. So my question to the minister is this: what is her definition of isolated school?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. As everyone knows, the HOG formula is now under revision to make sure that we are allocating funds appropriately for our changing demographics. And also the school boards have come forward with their focuses, how they would like to have the formula revised. At this time, we are working on the issue of small and isolated school. And I would like to add that I know that every member in this House values their small schools and they're in the communities. We still not have made the definition of isolated, small isolated schools. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe in the review of the HOG formula, they separate small from isolated. There are two different categories of schools, small schools and isolated schools. With the geography of Nova Scotia, we have many communities and we have many isolated communities. Students currently often travel up to 50 minutes one way to reach their school. And many times, Mr. Speaker, the road conditions are not good. They're country roads, they're gravel roads, they're narrow roads, and many of them have twists and turns. And in the wintertime, even though we have a wonderful snow removal program, thanks to the minister over there, when we get the graders purchased, I might add, the minister, so my question to the minister is this: once the review is completed, we know that the minister will either reject or accept the recommendations of the HOG formula. So my question to the minister is this: will the minister ensure that the definition of isolated school, when it becomes part of the HOG formula, speaks to the age of the student on the bus, the student safety on rural roads, student travel time, and distance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, and thank you for highlighting those very important points. Nova Scotia is a very interesting province. We have, very small rural communities, and there are major challenges of declining enrollment too. So I will make a commitment that as this formula is being revised, that I am listening to all the voices from our school boards and all of the considerations around any of the changes and revisions we make with the HOG formula. And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Thursday, the former Canadian Forces station in Shelburne was auctioned off for approximately $125,000. This was in addition to SWASDA's remaining assets, which were also auctioned off that day. Mr. Speaker, there are many questions which are still left with this whole issue, which the Minister has yet to address. Will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism outline how much was paid by the province with regards to auctioneers and legal fees, and how much money from the auction the province expects to receive?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, off the top of my head, I don't know what the cost of that action was, but I can tell you this: is that my expectation is that as a result of that auction, that I'd be very surprised if we receive any money whatsoever.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Okay. Did the minister say they weren't going to receive any money from the auction? Okay. Well, in the spring session of the legislature, it was brought to our attention that the NDP was using heavy-handed tactics to ensure that, I believe it was Royal Bank, received money that was owed to them by SWASDA. Yet this government has yet to act to support the small local businesses that are also owed money by SWASDA, along with former employees. will the minister take action? What action is the minister taking to ensure that local businesses and the former employees are going to be compensated appropriately with regards to the wind-up of SWASDA?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with respect to SWASDA and the auction, there's a legal process that's in place, Mr. Speaker, and we're allowing that process to play itself out. We will not interfere with the legal process in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if that process was in place when this government paid the banks off. Before they paid off the small businesses and the employees in Yarmouth, there are over 50 small businesses that are owed money from SWASDA, and to date, this government hasn't done anything to support them. For once, will this minister do something to support small business in the province and provide help to these businesses that need to have their money returned to them?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, this government came to power, recognized that there were some issues with SWASDA. Mr. Speaker, and we took action to remedy that, Mr. Speaker, something that previous governments would not do while they were in power, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, what we've done is we've authorized a forensic audit of SWASDA, trying to reveal where those monies have gone to, monies that we, taxpayers' money, have devoted and dedicated to SWASDA, which didn't go to the causes that they were dedicated for, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, with the 2011 fall lobster season now underway, Nova Scotians who depend on this lucrative fishery are already concerned about the predicted low price of lobster. My question is, what is the Minister of Fisheries' plan to address low prices for lobster in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I respect the question opposite. As the member opposite knows, there is low prices being affected all along our coast. District 35 in the Upper Bay of Fundy has just recently been involved with very high catches, historical highs. The neighbors to the south for the September-October season are also in very soft prices. I'm very aware of this, but we are working with our Lobster Council, Mr. Speaker, and we are very aware of the different options that's available to the industry. The industry is discussing these options as we speak, as these other districts open up, and there's ongoing dialogue, and I look forward to assisting them in any way. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister well knows, this is not a new issue to Nova Scotia, but when it happened a few years ago, the price of lobster was much lower. Efforts were undertaken to try to identify new markets, to look at value added for the lobster industry, because we all know it's in our whole province's interest that lobster fishermen get a good price for their lobster because our economy relies upon it. So my question to the Minister is, what new initiatives has this government put in place to identify new markets or value-added initiatives to get a better price for Nova Scotia lobster?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Again, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, there's a lot going on as we speak. There's discussions with the industry Atlantic-wide, with our 5 provinces, including Nova Scotia, regarding the Lobster Council and all the different options available to the industry. And yes, I agree with the member opposite. Since 2008, the industry as a whole has suffered very low prices, what we see in the marketplace. And there's a lot of work being done by our department, whether it's nationally or internationally, about developing markets in Asia and China. And all this is going on as we speak. And again, I look forward to having these discussions with the industry as we move forward. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when the NDP were in opposition, they continued to ask governments of the day for a plan on how they were going to deal with problems. And I know that the government in limited instances has tried to present plans on how they're going to deal with certain problems. We have differences of opinion as to how they're succeeding, but the question I have is that in light of the problems that exist with the lobster industry, that this is not something new, but something that's been tackled by the previous government and now this government, will the Minister of Fisheries present a plan to this House as to how his government plans on dealing with low lobster prices in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To the member opposite, I very clearly remember sitting on that side of the House in opposition and asked the third party presently to introduce a task force to deal with these issues as we speak. This minister, this government took action. We got the discussion going regarding the lobster councils. There is discussion going on with our Atlantic friends, and these are options that the industry needs to explore, needs to digest. I look forward to taking that leadership role, and we'll make life better for Nova Scotians. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, outside this chamber in the Ledge Council office, confusion is now reigning as those who wanted to appear before his committee, who this morning were told they can't appear before his committee.
I just ruled that out of order a little earlier, so I'll not allow it again for the second time.
No, I'll rephrase.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Justice. Can he tell the House whether those Nova Scotians who wish to speak up this afternoon and were told no are able to do so on the original schedule now of tomorrow?
It's still out of order. You're asking the committee chair to answer a question that I just ruled on earlier. It's out of order. If you want to rephrase the question, go right ahead, but you can't ask the question of the chair of the committee. I ruled that out of order earlier. No, I ruled that earlier. I gave the ruling. If you want to check hands or after the sitting, feel free to do so. Well, rephrasing the question, or that's it. I'll move on. Yes.
When can Nova Scotians?
What's that?
Up here. Okay,
Would the Minister inform the House what the plan is to hear from those Nova Scotians that wish to speak on this important issue?
the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. This evening we will exhaust our list as best we can, and for anyone that has had their name on that list and that does not get the opportunity to speak tonight, I will be more than pleased to see that we get the opportunity to meet with them tomorrow and hear their points of view.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm obviously pleased to hear that, but I do want to follow up and ask the Minister of Justice who told him to change it the first time around and who told him to put it back this time around.
Mr. Speaker.
It's out of order again because I'll read the same thing again and maybe we can digest it here this afternoon, okay? Okay, I'll read it again. Questions to ministers or to the committee chair concerning the proceedings work of the committee. When a question has been asked about a committee's proceedings, speakers have encouraged members to rephrase their question. So do you understand what I'm saying? Yes. Thank you very much. Would you please rephrase the question?
How long do they have? How long do they have to present?
Mr. Speaker, how long do these people have to present?
It's still out of order. Jeez. I'm going to move on to the next question, okay? The Honourable Member for the Halifax-Clayton Park.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is going to be for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, as the Premier is aware, the single most important tool that Nova Scotia has with regard to increasing immigration is our provincial nominee program. These tailor-made nominee programs have been successful in attracting immigrants in other provinces that traditionally have had challenges in doing so, and they've enabled those provinces to both enrich their communities and also improve their economies. Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia level has been capped in recent years, as we know, just in the last year. And the Premier said that he had spoken to both the Prime Minister and met with the Immigration Minister when he was in Ottawa recently. My question to the Premier is Given the efforts of the Premier to date, will the Premier confirm that the Nova Scotia cap on the provincial nominee program for 2012 still remains at 500?
Honourable the Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for an appropriate phrased and well-put question. Mr. Speaker, what I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that I have had the opportunity, as was indicated by the member, to meet with both the Prime Minister and with the Minister responsible. I have pointed out, in fact, in very similar words, what the member of the official opposition has said in relation to the program. I've asked him to consider a series of changes, recognizing that this was, in fact, the first year we actually hit the 500 nominee target, so that we, Nova Scotia, would be able to recruit more immigrants. He has suggested a number of other streams which we are investigating as well. Obviously, in the end, the question is, how do we encourage more of the immigrant population to come to the province, and we're working diligently to try and make sure that that happens.
The honourable member for Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I was looking to see if indeed he could confirm the 500. I'm not sure that that was entirely confirmed, but my understanding is that we are capped again for 2012 at 500 nominees or nominee families. Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows full well that the provincial nominee program allows the province to go out and market itself to the world. There's no other stream of immigration that enables the province to control its own destiny and ultimately its success in immigration. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be able to table the only letter that was sent by any member of this government with regard to raising the cap. It's a joint letter from the 4 premiers dated months after the government implemented the cap, the federal government that is, and nowhere does the letter specifically request an increase in the cap allotments for Nova Scotia, or for that matter for any of the other 3 Atlantic provinces. My question to the Minister is, why did the only letter sent by the Premier, to the Premier, why did the only letter sent by the Premier not specifically request an increase to Nova Scotia's provincial nominee cap?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, there was the joint opinion of the premiers of Atlantic Canada that the caps on immigration on the nominee program would be detrimental to all of the provinces in the region. So that was sent for that reason. With respect to the submissions that were made to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Immigration, they were made personally by me, asking them to increase the nominee level to the province. And I should explain to the member opposite the reason why the cap, which is in place, and whether or not it will be renewed, I don't think a final decision has been made on that. But if it will be renewed, here's why. The federal government has capped overall the number of immigrants that it intends to bring into the country. Right? They are not going to expand that pool. So what they have said is that all of the provinces and territories have their own levels that have been set. The federal government has the level that they have set. So any increase in any of the numbers, any of the cap, means that the province must either take from the federal government or take from one of the other provinces, which, as you can see, would not be acceptable to either the federal government or the other provinces. What I can say is that the province has got allocations of additional seats or additional numbers that have not been used by the other provinces.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we certainly know, and the Premier knows as well, that this is one of the most important issues facing our province, because we have demographic problems, we have an aging population, we have out-migration, which we've talked about here a great deal around the jobs. Mr. Speaker, the provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, just to name 4, have had significant increases. 400, 600, 300. BC has 300 more nominees as well. Those provinces understood the same formula. Those provinces lobbied hard and got what they needed for their province. That's an increase in numbers within the pie, as the other minister likes to speak about. All achieved it because their provinces and the governments in their provinces fought. And my question to the Premier is, given that Nova Scotia has seen no increase and will again in 2012 see no increase in our nominee allotment, what will it take to make the Premier recognize the current strategy is failing?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I understand it, the Minister of Immigration has announced that all of the nominee programs have been capped and not changed for any of the provinces, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the simple fact of the matter is that until last year, the province of Nova Scotia did not use the number of nominees that it was given. So this government was the first government to actually use the number of nominees that were allocated. In addition, Mr. Speaker, there are nominee quotas that have been assigned to the other provinces, and this year, because some of them were not used, the province of Nova Scotia was able to access some of the unused nominee program in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Immigration is well aware of the desire of this province to increase the overall number of nominees. Ultimately, though, it is a decision of the federal government.
Honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, 3,241 residents of the Annapolis Valley signed a petition. Thousands more have spoken. They recognize that changes to physician coverage at the Berwick Clinic, which the Minister of Health and Wellness approved, will have an effect on the healthcare delivery system throughout the entire valley. Since the Berwick Clinic was functioning well, it was serving 22,000 patients a year, and most importantly, a model of collaborative care, and was reducing pressures on the local and regional emergency rooms. My question to the Minister, why did the Minister approve a reduction of hours in a medical clinic she simply wants to see more of in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I was pleased to have an opportunity to go to Berwick and tour the clinic, meet with staff, meet with people from the community. And Mr. Speaker, that was after I had already met with a delegation from the community earlier. And indeed, the Berwick Clinic is it's a very impressive small facility, and it's of great importance to Berwick and surrounding communities. Mr. Speaker, it still is not a model of collaborative care, although I'm hoping it will be now that our government have approved a nurse practitioner to be added into collaborative practice there. What was occurring, Mr. Speaker, was that physicians were closing their doctor's offices during the day and operating the clinic during the day. What we have done is we have approved a plan where doctors will be back in their offices during the day and working in the clinic in the evenings and on weekends, extending those hours. And when the nurse practitioner is recruited, then a more collaborative model of practice will be able to be in place in that clinic, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If only it were working. Mr. Speaker, health dollars saved as a result of this decision, on paper 125,000, in this half year 250,000 per year. Even board members have indicated this won't be realized. Cost pressures associated with clogged emergency rooms will be far greater than cost saved. On September 16, the Minister of Health met with officials from Berwick, and at the time the Minister committed to full consultation on the issue prior to changes made to the operation in October. Since that September meeting, the community heard nothing and officials were not consulted. My question to the Minister, why did the Minister commit to further consultations when, in fact, nothing took place.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to remember who was at that meeting. I don't believe the honourable member was at the meeting. I don't know why he thinks I committed to full consultations. My recollection, Mr. Speaker, is that I encouraged the delegation that I met with, of which the honourable member wasn't a part, to return to their community and collaborate with the Annapolis Valley District Health Authority, which deliver the services there. And I indicated to the delegation that I would encourage the District Health Authority to collaborate with those individuals, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, for those who are listening to this important question today, I want to clarify I was indeed with the minister and the deputy minister on that day, heard exactly what was going to take place, and there was going to be additional consultation, which did not take place. It did not take place from the DHA. The damage is being felt as we speak. The changes have occurred. Local emergency rooms are closing three times since the new beginnings at Berwick. Wait times at other ERs have increased. Over the last 2 weeks, some patients waited 7 to 10 hours. One needing a cast waited 6 hours one day, 10 hours the next day. And let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, 22,000 patients who were receiving excellent care and now have to find their way into other more expensive components of the healthcare system or go without care at all. My question to the minister, will she admit that the decision to change the hours of the Berwick Clinic was short-sighted and commit to reviewing this decision?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very well-functioning clinic. It will continue to be a well-functioning clinic. There are additional resources being put into that clinic for a nurse practitioner. And Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the honourable member that that was once a well-functioning hospital, and that hospital was closed by the Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. And if anybody did damage to the communities of Berwick and surrounding areas by withdrawing services to local people, Mr. Speaker, it is not this government. It was a former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Would he please tell us his definition for a clear cut?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It must be the last question of the day. I think we've come to this, but you know, we certainly know that clear cutting has gone on in the province for far too long at a too high a rate. In fact, it's around 96% of clear cutting, and that's what Nova Scotians said they no longer want. And we had a full review through the Natural Resources Strategy, and Nova Scotians told us over and over they wanted a change in the clear-cutting practices in this province, and that's exactly what we've done through the Path We Share, a Natural Resources Strategy for Nova Scotia. We've come up with two definitions. One is a layman's term, basically the removal of all trees on an area except for those that are under the wildlife or watercourse regulations, and if I have time, I'll get into the more detailed as we go along.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's surprising the minister would make light of such an important issue to so many people. As the minister, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, the former minister committed to reduce clear cutting by 50% and ban whole tree harvesting. Yet the definition that the government has introduced for clear cutting pretty much allows anything. There's very little that's considered a clear cut. Mr. Speaker, I will table an image depiction that's been done by a professional forester showing the difference between a clear cut and a non-clear cut according to the NDP government's own definition. There's very little difference. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that they have not lived up to the commitment that people thought they would live up to. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the NDP mislead Nova Scotians about their intentions to reduce clear-cutting when their true intentions were really to define clear-cutting in such a way that anything would still be allowed?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, Nova Scotians care about their woodlands, care about their forest, and, you know, this government cares about our forestry practices in this province. And we had a very comprehensive three-phase strategy session that listened to Nova Scotians, listened to experts in the field, and then, and as you know, we come out in August with the Path We Share, a natural resources strategy for Nova Scotia, 2011 to 2020. And it lays clearly out there that the clear-cutting practices in this province are not acceptable, and that we have a goal now of 50% clear-cutting only within a 5-year frame. The clock is ticking on that, and we are working on it, so we have a clear definition of where we're going. We have a vision for forestry in this province, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The time allotted for oral questions put by members to Minister has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, on May 20th, 2009, the Premier said, and I quote from the Chronicle Herald, quote, "We're not going to raise taxes." On April 6, 2010, I have a budget bulletin here, which says, and I quote, "The provincial budget of 2010, less than a year later, outlines tax changes, including a restoration of the harmonized sales tax to 15%. I'll table both documents for the view of the House. Mr. Speaker, 3 times in question period today, the Premier said he's kept all his promises. That's clearly misleading, and I ask that he withdraw those remarks.
I'm sorry, but that is not a point of order. That's a disagreement between 2 members over facts. I will now recognize the House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I rise firstly on a point of privilege.
Point of privilege?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the discussion that's taken place regarding law amendments, it seems to be some confusion in government's responses to the questions asked today, and it's unclear still how many the government has relented on that will be heard from tomorrow. So I've put this in written form, so you can rule on it at your leisure, Mr. Speaker, and then there'll be a form for the clerk. The government's move to curtail debate at Law Amendments Committee is violating the privilege of freedom of speech provided to all members in this House, and it could be argued that it is also violating the same privilege afforded to witnesses at law amendments as they are guests of the legislature while they are witnesses to the committee. On the first point, the most important privilege granted to members is that of freedom of speech within debate. This is the most essential element of debate in the House and has been recognized as such for hundreds of years within the British parliamentary system of government. For the government to curtail debate at Law Amendments Committee at the last minute and to restrict presentations to the committee means that members will not be able to effectively present the opinions and facts of Nova Scotians. If I am not able to hear from all Nova Scotians, I am not able to fully debate this issue in the House. No member in this House is. On the second point, and I'll be brief, Mr. Speaker, witnesses to committees are afforded similar privilege when called to testify before committee. If they cannot fully prepare due to the last-minute curtailment, it could be argued that their privilege has been violated as well. Presenters will not be able to effectively prepare and present their facts and opinions fully and openly to the committee. And Mr. Speaker, I'll end up with a quote from O'Brien, and the quote is, "This right is also extended to individuals who appear before the House or its committees in order to encourage truthful and complete disclosure without fear of reprisal or other adverse actions as a result of their testimony." Close quote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I will take that under advisement and report back to the House as soon as possible. I will now recognize the House Leader for the official opposition to call business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Resolution 1110?
Resolution number 1110. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure. I think we. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I think my understanding is we're going to adjust the times by a minute or so all around, so everybody's 9 minutes instead of 10, but I think so. Not that makes a lot of difference. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about energy rates on a very, I think it's an important day to discuss this when we've had the Utility and Review Board decision come down yesterday. The Leader of the Official Opposition, one of his first questions today in question period, he asked the Premier how much residential power bills are going to increase between December 31st of this year and January 1st of next year. And the Premier got it wrong. He seemed only aware of the 6.1% increase, when in fact, the total increase is in the double digits. Mr. Speaker, there is the 6.1% announced yesterday. There is the 3.2% fuel adjustment mechanism. There is the increase in the demand-side management tax that the NDP added to the bills that was first proposed by the Tory government. And then, on top of that, there is the deferred fuel adjustment mechanism charge from last year. And I think all Nova Scotians should be concerned when their government claims to be concerned about energy issues and the cost of power, and the Premier doesn't even know how much bills are going to go up by. That's a problem. We heard the Premier recently talk about Muskrat Falls and go to Cape Breton to make an announcement about how this was going to be the savior for Cape Breton and this was going to be the savior for Nova Scotians. It was, in fact, he was reported as saying that it would bring cheaper power to Nova Scotia, when in fact, we know that the price point, the landed price point, is 14 to 16 cents, which is more than what we're paying now. Emera has confirmed that the price for the Muskrat Falls power will be similar to other renewables in Nova Scotia, so more expensive than coal, more expensive than many of the other options. And I'm not suggesting that we go back to a coal-based future, but the fact is it's misleading of the Premier to suggest that that will reduce power rates. And then he went one further, saying that it will create, and he did it again today in question period, create thousands and thousands of jobs. There will be thousands of man-hours created in Newfoundland in the construction of the dam structure. That's absolutely correct. But it is absolutely misleading to say there will be thousands of jobs created in Nova Scotia from the Churchill Falls project in Nova Scotia. It's absolutely incorrect. Yes, there are Nova Scotia companies that will have the opportunity to bid as secondary bidders to Newfoundland companies. That is in the Memorandum of Understanding. Secondarily to Newfoundland companies. If Nova Scotians get work out of that project, it will be work in Newfoundland, not work in Nova Scotia. And the Premier as much had to admit that by the time I asked questions in question period. And that's an important distinction, because it's no different than sending people to Fort McMurray to work if you're sending people to another province. The Premier has been misleading Nova Scotians on that project. And his best answer is to come back and say that Liberals are against efficiency, or they're against Churchill Falls, or all kinds of ridiculous statements. When in fact, if we look at efficiency programs, for example, we have argued that the costs of efficiency in Nova Scotia should be borne by their shareholders. Not that efficiency programs shouldn't exist, but that they should be borne by shareholders and not ratepayers who are already paying too much. And in fact, Dan O'Connor from the Premier's office wrote a letter on behalf of the NDP during the election saying the same thing, saying the NDP opposed putting such a tax on power bills. And so instead of the Premier saying, sorry, he changed his mind, which would be the right thing to do, and which people could reasonably understand and debate, he refuses to admit that that letter, he refuses to acknowledge that that letter was even written during the election, despite the fact that we've tabled that letter over and over in this House. You know, Mr. Speaker, it frustrates me that in raising the very important issue of how power rates are hurting our economy, how they're hurting people of all walks of life, how they're increasing the cost of goods, how they're making it more expensive for people on community services and people who are just struggling to get by on minimum wage jobs and even middle-income families. It frustrates me that instead of the government addressing the real issue of increasing power rates, and instead of the government addressing and listening to the suggestions of opposition parties and Nova Scotians, the best response is insults. Because as a caucus, we've introduced legislation that we believe furthers the discussion on trying to address power rates. And I know that the third party has also suggested legislation that they feel would make a change. But instead of having an open and honest discussion about what ideas might work, where the future might be, the best that the government members can do is to throw insults at the opposition over it. And that doesn't get us anywhere. That doesn't make life more affordable for Nova Scotians. Power rates are rapidly becoming the most significant household expense for families of every single income group in this province. And the fact that the government chose a time of increasing power rates to add a new electricity tax onto the bills of every single homeowner and every single business in this province should be of concern to every Nova Scotian. It is a cost that should be paid by ratepayers, and so, or by shareholders, not ratepayers. And so, Mr. Speaker, in my last minute or so, I just wish to address the fact that power rates have been rapidly increasing. They've gone up. Before yesterday's increase, they had gone up by 33 or 36%. Now we have an almost additional double-digit increase, and we know that there are future increases in the years to come. Is that 52 or 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. It's a real issue. We look at why food prices are going up, or we say, well, why have clothing prices gone up, or why have any number of goods or services gone up? Well, one of the contributing factors is power rates. Anybody in this House who's run a business or worked in a business in a capacity where they have to pay those bills knows that they have to incorporate those bills, the cost of power, into the cost of their goods and services. I know that there are members on both sides of the House who have run businesses now and know that. And so to ignore the fact that increasing power rates cause a hardship to families and actually result in getting hit over and over again is to ignore a very serious issue. Increasing power rates not only increase our expenses at home, but they result in higher property taxes. They result in higher expenses for the government, which the government has to absorb. Increasing power rates are increases for our hospitals, our schools, all of those things. And there's something that has to be taken seriously, because there are people that honestly cannot put food on the table and also pay their power bill at the end of the day. And we need to be concerned about that. And I don't think that there is enough concern being shown in this legislature by government over the real impact. It's not enough to keep referring it to the Utility and Review Board and saying it's up to them to solve the problem, because it's not up to them. We were elected to this chamber to make life better for Nova Scotians, and the biggest challenge that Nova Scotians are facing is power. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place to speak to resolution number 1110. Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely true that nobody likes to see electricity rates go up. And that is why I'm so proud that when we formed government, the first thing we did was we removed 8% of the HST on home energy. And Mr. Speaker, there's no question that over the past few months, we as Nova Scotians realize just how much of a critical role power rates can play, whether it's for large pulp and paper mills or an individual homeowner. Mr. Speaker, the UARB decision provided a modified rate to the mills, and that will give them a degree of price stability and certainty over the next 3 years. And that will be one positive factor here in the province that will help see those mills stay viable. Mr. Speaker, that means rates will be slightly higher for everyone because of the rate approved for mills. However, the alternative of losing those mills, losing the associated jobs and their share of electricity costs would result in even higher rates. Mr. Speaker, our government truly does understand the burden of rising electricity prices on the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians, and that is why when we took office, we removed the HST off of energy. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, this government cares about Nova Scotians and our most vulnerable. And our government, since being elected, has implemented many programs to benefit Nova Scotians and their families. Our energy rebate program, which is an automatic rebate equal to the provincial portion of the HST on energy bills, was implemented by this government. The Home Heating Assistance Rebate Program, which is a rebate of $200 for eligible applicants who heat their home with oil, electricity, wood, propane pellets, natural gas, or coal. Mr. Speaker, that demonstrates our commitment and our caring for Nova Scotians and their family. Free home energy upgrades for low-income homeowners who heat with electricity through the Efficiency Nova Scotia program. Our Department of Community Services have implemented income assistance programs for our most vulnerable. And there are many charitable organizations that also offer assistance for our most vulnerable, such as the Salvation Army, the Good Neighbor Energy Fund. Mr. Speaker, it is initiatives like these that truly help take the burden off of Nova Scotian families. Mr. Speaker, our government is also moving away from volatile fossil fuels, and that in turn will help reduce the impact of sudden price changes on Nova Scotians. That is why we have legislated and are developing some of the most aggressive renewable energy targets in the world. And Mr. Speaker, I did say in the world, and that is something we as a Nova Scotian government and Nova Scotians can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the cost of coal and other fossil fuels keep rising each year, and Nova Scotians end up paying more and more for that electricity. It is more important than ever that we Nova Scotians get ourselves off of the heavy reliance on coal and fossil fuels, and that we move to cleaner, renewable resources, which will mean more stable energy prices for Nova Scotians in the future. If governments of the past would have dealt with the province's reliance on fossil fuels over 15 years ago, when costs started to increase, we would not be in the position we are today. That's why our government is aggressively moving forward with the Lower Churchill project and other renewable projects like wind and tidal power. If our government does not act now, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that we move from fossil fuels to more renewable electricity, prices for Nova Scotians will continue to increase year after year. Nova Scotians' dependence on imported coal and the failure of previous governments to implement a plan to bring stability to electricity prices is reflected in our electricity bills, Mr. Speaker. The price of coal has increased 76%, that's 76% in the last 5 years. our government, Mr. Speaker, is doing something about that. Our vision for Nova Scotia's energy future is no secret to this House. It is outlined in our Renewable Electricity Plan, which was released, Mr. Speaker, in April of 2010. This plan clearly states that there are upfront costs associated with developing more renewable sources of energy, possibly an average of 1 to 2% on electricity bills in the short term. But it is an investment, Mr. Speaker, that we Nova Scotians cannot afford not to make. Our plan is about making life more affordable in the long run. Doing nothing will cost us far more in the future and for our future generations. Renewable electricity prices do not go up over time in the same way as carbon-based fuels will. Moving towards local renewable energy sources will help stabilize energy prices in the future and protects consumers from the volatility of world markets and energy supply shortages. Mr. Speaker, we cannot keep our eyes closed. Our plan will also support as much as $1.5 billion in green investments and create an estimate 5,000 to 7,000 jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker. We are taking a balanced approach to transforming our electricity system in the best interests of all Nova Scotians. Our plan is based on an intensive process of public and expert input that includes consultation with Nova Scotians on how to stabilize rates through increasing renewables. Mr. Speaker, our approach will create jobs, it will stabilize electricity prices, and it will reduce our environmental footprint. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker, and this government is implementing it. Mr. Speaker, I have 3 more minutes and 2 more minutes and 2 more seconds. 2 more minutes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I cannot express the importance of this government's plan in implementing our renewable energy plan for the future of your children, my children, our grandchildren, for the stability of electricity prices throughout the province, for the environment of the province. And Mr. Speaker, you know I'm not now speaking off of my crafted notes here, but Mr. Speaker, our government does care about Nova Scotians, and we have provided relief for high energy costs on electricity bills, Mr. Speaker, and for that I'm very proud to be part of this government. Mr. Speaker, 8% off of home heating is not insignificant. And Mr. Speaker, that is one of the commitments that this government said they would make, and this government kept that commitment to Nova Scotians. We are very concerned about the most vulnerable Nova Scotians in the province, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to provide relief for those most vulnerable Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, this is the most aggressive government in putting forward plans to assist Nova Scotians who are most vulnerable, unlike previous governments who just didn't see the bigger picture. Mr. Speaker, they didn't see the vision for moving forward to a cleaner environment, getting ourselves off of coal, and Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to be part of this government that does have a vision for the future of renewable electricity, and I'm proud to be a member of this government who has a vision for our future generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very glad to have an opportunity to speak to this resolution tonight and be part of the debate, and I'm happy that the member who just spoke is proud to be a member of the NDP, who is actually Well, we're still waiting to see them other thousands of jobs that they've been bragging about, Mr. Speaker. And I just heard, I believe the quote was 5,000 to 7,000 jobs, and I would be interested in whether or not that member could table that information as to where exactly them jobs might be, what sectors we're at in this province, because that's good stuff. If she can put that out today, we're pretty happy about that, Mr. Speaker, and we want to see. But somehow, Mr. Speaker, we don't see that. What we do see is people leaving here, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker. People struggling every day because they can't afford to pay their power bills. And Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tell you a little story about people that come into our offices. I'm sure yours and every member in this House. In all honesty, or most of the members in this House, Mr. Speaker, would have people coming in and saying, we can't pay our power bill. But you know what? They're embarrassed, Mr. Speaker, so they wait. They don't know what to do. 1 month goes by when they should come in, Mr. Speaker, and they should talk to you then, and they should say, can you help me now? And my bill's maybe $300 or $400 or maybe a little more. But they don't. They wait. 2 months go by. 2 months go by, Mr. Speaker, you know what? And then they start thinking, now it's $1,000, and now they're getting their notices in the mail saying, disconnect, 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 and they're pretty lenient. You'll go another month usually, and then here you got a couple $1,000, Mr. Speaker, before you that you owe. And unfortunately, it's almost always this time of year, Mr. Speaker, when people are struggling. It's cold, they got to have heat, Mr. Speaker, and what do? They're trying to figure out, how am I going to pay this bill? So they come in, they see us. Mr. Speaker, they come in and they see us, and they want us to try and work something out for them. Now, in some cases, I'm going to give Nova Scotia Power credit here. They have a great lady working in that office that we have a contact with that a lot of times you can make some arrangements. That's what our job is, Mr. Speaker, and I say that unfortunately, that we have to be doing that in this day and age. But that's the reality, Mr. Speaker. We're still doing it, and we do it because it's what we were elected to do, look after our constituents. But they're saying, Mr. Speaker, I can't afford to pay, or I can't afford to feed my family. That's the reality. People think that's just a saying that's being repeated here. That's not just a saying. That's the facts. That's the reality of life in Nova Scotia today, Mr. Speaker. It's tough times. Everybody knows the job losses. We've seen them. We've seen major layoffs at Fundy Gypsum in the last couple of years. 150 jobs are gone there. We've seen them in all kinds of other areas in this province, Mr. Minus just laid off. Minus Basin just laid off 13 people. Now, 13 people may seem like an insignificant number or small, Mr. Speaker. Not in the town of Hantsport, not in the constituency of Hants West. 13 jobs, good paying jobs, Mr. Speaker. What will those people do? Well, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, those people that were laid off at Fundy Gypsum, they went on the EI program for a year when they couldn't find anything else, and then that runs out. What do, Mr. Speaker? While the whole time the bills are still coming in. Phone bills with increased HST on them, Mr. Speaker, other regular bills that would come into a household, the purchase of food, Mr. Speaker, and the necessities in life, Mr. Speaker, with extra taxes put on by a government, which was a joke today. The Premier stood in this House and said, we stayed committed to every promise that they made. And that may be paraphrasing, Mr. Speaker, but that's exactly what he said. Now, we already know, Mr. Speaker, he promised the people in the last campaign in 2009, Mr. Speaker, that we would not raise taxes. Well, Mr. Speaker, he's done worse. He's raised taxes. He's allowed the power bills to go up. And this is, and I hope I have time to go into it, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes here. We keep saying that the government has nothing to do with Nova Scotia Power and their rates. They keep passing the buck off to this little unit they call the UARB, Mr. Speaker. Well, here's an interesting thing. We have Nova Scotia Power, which is a private industry in Emira. There's their parent company. They're the only company that I know that's a private company in this province that depends on a government, an arm's length government, call it whatever you want, but a government entity that says, oh, we'll set the rate for you. How is that not the responsibility of government? It is very much so, Mr. Speaker. And the decision this week that was put out, the board's decision reads, Mr. Speaker, the objective of having informed consumers is a worthwhile goal. We believe that. However, the board considers that the decision of how to inform ratepayers about the impact of government regulations and programs is a policy decision made by the province, Mr. Speaker. It says right there, Mr. Speaker, the board agrees that government is responsible for that entity, for that body. The government should have some control that allows, and they can, Mr. Speaker, it's a swipe of the minister's pen. So yes or no to rates. Now this party, Mr. Speaker, we put forward 3 pieces of legislation in this House, in this session, Mr. Speaker. Talks about transparency in power rates, talks about eliminating bonuses from the Power Rates Act. Well, we were able to get through there, Mr. Speaker, for this year. We're going to have to do it all again next year. We're going to have to attend meetings, and we're going to have to take the people's points, Mr. Speaker, to those meetings and to those companies and to the government and say, this is not right. We need to look at how we're going to be doing things in a fair and equitable manner when it comes to increased rates. Now, we hear a lot of rhetoric in this House, Mr. Speaker, all around. I'll give it that. We hear this party's got the right idea, that party's got the right idea. If there were ever a time, Mr. Speaker, in this House where members had to come together and work together on a plan for Nova Scotians, it is certainly now around the energy sector, Mr. Speaker, and where we're going into the future. We can stand in this House and we can all claim that we've got the best idea. I don't think, and I've heard a minister over there and previous members in this House, Mr. Speaker, state not any one party or any one member has all the right ideas, Mr. Speaker, has all the best ideas. But there is a time, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you right now, in talking to the people that come into my office, in the coffee shops or on the street, Mr. Speaker, they're saying, it's time for all of you to grow up, Mr. Speaker, to come together, to negotiate, to work hard, to make things better, to make life better in Nova Scotia. But what they're saying, Mr. Speaker, is not quite exactly that. They want to see opposition parties work with the government party, member work with member, committee work with committee, take whatever it takes, Mr. Speaker, to put on the table a plan that will work to reduce the cost of energy in this province in the long term. But we're not getting that. Now, Mr. Speaker, we hear about the honourable member from Dartmouth East stood up and said, well, they could get power here, get power there in Newfoundland and so on. Well, Mr. Speaker, those are years out. He's right. That's a long ways away. Deals are not finalized. Things are not done. Now, what's being missed here, perhaps, is that every 10 minutes, I believe, Nova Scotia Power's measuring energy consumption in this province. They're buying by the hour, or even less than that, all the time. There's no reason that can't be looked at in more detail. Maybe we do need to buy from other places. Is that the answer? Is producing more the answer? We talk about fossil fuels. Well, there's other ways off fossil fuels, Mr. Speaker. We hear about coal. Well, coal's this and coal's that. But you know what? We got all kinds of it, Mr. Speaker. We talk about jobs. If that member wants to stand up and talk about jobs, let's talk about the reality of jobs. Let's look at the coal in Cape Breton. Yeah, you want to put good paying jobs on the table? Great. Employ some people in Cape Breton and start bringing coal out of that mine. You know what? You got a lot of technology today, Mr. Speaker. No problem. Got to be some way of making that coal cleaner. They say, oh, it's not as clean, costs more. I don't think so, Mr. Speaker. Do we care about the jobs here in this province? Or do we care about buying it from Brazil and other countries and giving them the money? If you wanted to talk about the increased cost, maybe there'd be some increased cost when it came to hiring people and putting them to work, which has itself a turnover. Mr. Speaker, working people are taxpayers. Taxpayers are a good thing in this province, Mr. Speaker. They keep the economy going. Are we even thinking about that? No, we're just going to continue to buy from foreign countries, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to unfortunately let Nova Scotia Power have the right of way, because the URB, in all honesty, is letting, through the government, is letting the URB have a right of way in telling Nova Scotians what they're going to pay a private company. Mr. Speaker, that's wrong. That's not right. There needs to be some revision. If it's a legislative change, if it's a policy change, or whatever it is, Mr. Speaker, you need to sit down and you need to start looking at this in a broader spectrum, Mr. Speaker. The bigger picture here has got to be a better deal for today's families. Mr. Speaker, if I recall, that was the promise in 2009 on all the signage I read with NDP stickers on them. A better deal for today's families. We know that's not the case. Mr. Speaker, it can't be. Taxes are higher, there are less jobs, Mr. Speaker. It's just not a better deal. Times are tough, Mr. Speaker. What are they doing? They're talking about this and they're talking about that. That was a wonderful speech somebody wrote. Again, somewhere over in Utopia, wherever it came from, Mr. Speaker. That's not the facts in this province. The fact of the matter remains, Mr. Speaker, prices of energy are high and there's no plan. Mr. Speaker, we need to have a plan. Somehow, Mr. Speaker, the government has to be able to take control, and the legislation that we have put forward would allow a lot of opportunities. But the government, Mr. Speaker, in their infinite wisdom says, no, the opposition parties don't know what they're talking about. Why call one of their bills? That might make sense. That might even be working together to call an opposition bill, especially a bill of something as important to do with energy, Mr. Speaker. No, because we're here in Nova Scotia and we're in this House, Mr. Speaker, we can't do that. That's just not the way business works, Mr. Speaker. Oh, but heaven forbid we work together. Well, Mr. Speaker, because unfortunately I'm running out of time and down to seconds, I hope that we're able to come together in this House somehow and put together a plan that will work in the long term, Mr. Speaker, the long term for Nova Scotians. And with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. I would like to now make a ruling with respect to the points of order raised earlier by the members for Cape Breton South and Argyll, both House leaders for the respective parties. I have now had the opportunity to review both Shane and previous speakers' rulings. The question of the Speaker's authority over the proceedings in committees generally is dealt with in those authorities. Simply put, the Speaker does not exercise procedural control over the committees. A previous speaker ruled on this very issue with respect to a dispute over proceedings in the Law Amendments Committee. I have that ruling here, and I will read two passages from it. It is a fundamental proposition that the problems arising in a committee of the House should be dealt with within that committee, and only after the proper procedures that have been followed in the committee should a matter come to this House. This issue is also canvassed in Bouchain, which states at page 222, the Speaker has ruled on many occasions that it is not competent for the Speaker to exercise procedural controls over the committees. Committees are and must remain masters of their own procedure. There is also a practical problem with that I hope that members will recognize. The meeting of the Law Amendments Committee has not happened yet. While it may come to pass that tonight is the last time for the presenters on Bill 102, that has not yet happened, so I'm being asked to rule on something that may not happen. The proper sequence for that should occur is for the members of the committee to raise the procedural issues at the meeting that is taking place this afternoon. The proper form for this is in the committee itself. If the Law Amendments Committee votes to not hear further presenters, and an appeal of that decision may be made to the House pursuant to Rule 61(2). Accordingly, I rule that the circumstances do not give rise to a valid point of order, and I encourage the members of the Law Amendments Committee to deal with these concerns at that committee. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate your ruling, and it sounds to me like it's coming from a very learned speaker, looking quoting Bouchain, and I didn't hear Sir Erskine May, but perhaps we'll get that on a future day. But anyway, I do appreciate the ruling. I don't necessarily agree with it, but because there is such an uncertainty about what's happening here. We just came from committee, and over there they're bending over backwards to say that they're going to be working tomorrow on Bill 102. They're scrambling to take credit for the change. So anyway, the change in government policy actually negates the ruling. But I hope on the order of privilege that I may have a better result. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Honourable House Leader for the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank you for that response. And just to continue along that issue is that there was a number of things going on that was not made aware of the committee members that we were hearing from, of course, those presenters. But of course, your ruling is such that you cannot see what's going on in the future. It seems like the government is making a change. So I guess by bringing it up, we did get the result that we were looking for, which was changes in that committee to make sure people were being heard. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I will now recognize and go back to debate the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and say a few minutes on the resolution. 110, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate all the speakers on this particular bill and how passionate they are in speaking about the energy issues that are facing Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, all of us, regardless of where our constituencies are, whether it's in rural Nova Scotia or urban Nova Scotia, understand the pressures that are being faced by families today in meeting the rising cost of energy. As we had talked about today during question period, there's a misconception out there that energy costs are going up 6%, Mr. Speaker. They're actually going up about 10%. When you add on the 6.1 rate, general rate increase, the 3.2% increase, Mr. Speaker, on what is the fuel adjustment mechanism, and then the additional doubling of the, as we affectionately call it over here, the NDP electricity tax, Mr. Speaker, will take an increase of about 10% across the board for Nova Scotia consumers, Mr. Speaker. Something has to be done. I've made many suggestions in this House. I believe it is time, quite frankly, that we break the monopoly. I think it is time that we now allow renewable energy producers to sell directly into to customers. It wasn't all that long ago, Mr. Speaker, long before I was in this House, when there was the issue around telephones and phone service. It was a monopoly in this province, and when it was deemed that we needed competition, what happened? Everyone said it was going to be the collapse of phone service in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, the only thing that's happened is that consumers are getting competition and getting a better price. Phone service today is cheaper today than it was 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker. We should be allowing that same issue when it comes to energy. I, for one, have trumpeted for quite some time and have talked about the Lower Churchill project. It is, I believe, a good project. I believe it will create a lot of jobs in Newfoundland and Labrador. It will create a few jobs in Nova Scotia, but it will create a possibility, Mr. Speaker, of creating a transmission infrastructure inside of our province that will allow us to have a renewable energy sector that will be able to sell into the grid. In my view, I hope that they'll be able to sell directly to any customer in the province of Nova Scotia, or quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, anywhere they choose to, be able to distribute that energy across the board. One of the interesting things, and I know I only have a few minutes, but transmission is the major issue here. Well, there was lots of talks about renewable energy. Well, Mr. Speaker, you cannot put another wind farm in southwestern Nova Scotia on the grid. It doesn't have the capacity. There's no capacity. We can harness the Bay of Fundy. We can't put it on the grid in southwestern Nova Scotia. While we all like to stand around and get our pictures taken with turbines and because it looks good, the key is transmission and the interconnecting of Atlantic Canada to ensure that not only when Lower Churchill comes on board, but the fact that we can bring in energy from Quebec, the fact that we can buy some energy from New Brunswick, the fact, Mr. Speaker, when we harness the Bay of Fundy, that we as a province can become the beneficiaries of that energy by allowing it distributed across our province. That is the key for energy security, not only in this province, but in Atlantic Canada. And I hope as we move forward that not only do we talk about the link into Newfoundland and Labrador, that we look at the entire transmission system in Atlantic Canada and across our region, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on resolution 1857.
1857. That's right. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, do I have 10 minutes as per the original schedule? Very good. Well, thank you so much, and I'm very pleased to be able to rise today, which is the Liberal Opposition Day, to continue a theme that I haven't had enough chance to speak about, but our members certainly have, and that is the theme of affordability and about basically Nova Scotians surviving economically in these tough times. And I know that the members on the opposite side of the House have indicated to us that they're tired of this theme. They don't want to hear us continue on it, but this is a very important issue for Nova Scotians, and this is so much more important than some of the bills that are before us here in the House today, because the issues that we're hearing about every day in our ridings are about affordability, about being able to pay your power bill, about being able to continue to meet all the needs that families have in terms of the costs and the pressures upon them. And this is all being done in a time when many people feel uncertainty about their businesses, if they're business owners. You know, the level of business confidence is not strong right now because there are a lot of uncertainties, and the government themselves like to talk about the worldwide uncertainties, but the business owners deal with those and the local uncertainties, the uncertainties that are brought, you know, to their doorstep by decisions of the government, and sometimes by an sort of an abdication of their responsibility. And I think that's often what happens when the government uses the UARB as the excuse that it's arm's length and they can't influence it, when in fact the UARB is now making decisions which are hurting Nova Scotians, hitting them hard in the pocketbook, and really not protecting our consumers. And I think that that's very important. So, Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us today, this 1857, speaks to, in the operative clause, speaks to the taxing of Nova Scotians and the NDP government's attack on Nova Scotians in terms of their tax policies. And I think this points very clearly to, first of all, the increase in our consumption tax, which is the harmonized sales tax, as we know it, the HST in Nova Scotia. And when the rest of the country has enjoyed a decrease in the HST as a result of the government, the federal government lowering it by 2 cents over the first couple of years of their mandate, what the government of Nova Scotia did, the NDP government, stepped in and said, oh, there's extra capacity there. We're used to 15%, and there's an ability to bring it back in, so let's do that. And I think they did it based on some really false information, suggesting that we were on a course of disaster if this was not done. That's how it was sold to Nova Scotians, that we were on a disastrous path to being out of whack, let us say, and that we were going to go into billions of dollars more debt. But in fact, the very year this is brought in, the government sees a surplus that was in excess, Mr. Speaker, in excess of the HST, beyond what the HST brought in. The surplus would have been seen anyway, with or without. So there's quite
Order,
a difference.
please.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, those numbers speak for themselves. The amount that would have been raised from the HST that can be directly attributable to the HST is a part of that surplus, and in fact the surplus went beyond it. So it wasn't alone what brought us into surplus. There were other factors. It tells Nova Scotians that the HST increase, at least that year, wasn't necessary. Maybe it is in the future. Maybe there are other times of uncertainty. But I would say the government brought it in year one of their mandate for one reason alone, because they wanted the extra revenue and they wanted it 4 years before they face the electorate again. If they waited to raise the HST later when maybe the urgency was greater, it would be something that the electorate will remember. But I'd like to remind members of the House that will be our job during an election, to go out and to speak to Nova Scotians and to point out where things were done that have harmed them financially, that were entirely not necessary. Now, in the same budget, a few small items were exempted from HST, and I'm sure that those items are appreciated when people are buying children's diapers and a few other things that were covered under that. But I think what's important to know is that every single purchase is now 2% higher than it was previously. And that is not, the justification for that has not borne out in fact. There's number one. Number two would be, I would go to gas prices, Mr. Speaker. The gas prices that we have in Nova Scotia, again, are being regulated by a price-fixing system, a regulation system that's being monitored and dictated by the UARB that used to be within government, but government didn't like that because then they had some direct control and responsibility. It was better to throw that off again and make it an arm's length arrangement with the UARB. That's one more area where the government is abdicating their responsibility, not governing, not taking control, but allowing some outside arm's length agency to do it for them and to say they have no control. And we've just heard a debate here that was more than half an hour of discussion about power rates, Mr. Speaker. And you know that power rates, again, are regulated by the Utility and Review Board, not by government, by the UARB. And government says they're only just listening. They're just bystanders in the whole process. Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia can make the connection between increased costs and this government that is sitting in power today in Nova Scotia. And I think that's the important thing that we need to remember, is that the people of Nova Scotia are smart, they listen, they read the papers, they read the blogs and the tweets, they're following the news on television, and they know they can connect the dots. And the government is hoping that they won't do that. But our job here in opposition is to make sure that we tell the story as we see it, that we've seen an increase in our HST of 2%, and that people who come into our offices and are telling us how difficult it is to make their mortgages, to make ends meet, to pay for the costs that are essential in their lives, understand what the impact of 2% more is in their budget every single week. And they do connect that directly back to a policy instituted and brought in the first years of the mandate of the NDP government. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that I wanted to speak about gas prices because the government members and now ministers and the Premier had clearly said in opposition that it was wrong to keep the tax on tax, which is on our mobility tax. So we include a mobility tax, motive tax, a motive fuel tax on every litre sold at the pump. And on top of that, we add HST at 15%, not 13, but 15%, because the government added 2 cents to that as well. So now we have, again, the continued tax on tax at a higher rate than we would have previously seen it, and no indication whatsoever from government that they will even review that. Even though in opposition they said it was immoral, that it was wrong, that it didn't belong. And so that's one thing. Regulation, again, is another point that is affecting our tax prices. And we have spoken out here in the Liberal caucus from day one when the Conservative government introduced regulation. And we've said it just doesn't work. And even the government of the day, the Conservative government of the day, said this won't keep our prices lower, but we hope it will provide some stability. It was about stable prices. But the government now, the NDP government, has maintained that despite the cost to do so, and that is a cost over to the UARB now because those provincial employees that did do the work are moved over to the Utility and Review Board, and the government of Nova Scotia has given up all responsibility for it. Well, the people of Nova Scotia ask, why did they elect us if we're not here to make some of the tough decisions, and if we're not going to take responsibility? They wonder why we have ministers who have very small portfolios that don't even have ministries under their control. In fact, we have ministers with no budgets. How can that be? You know, I think the idea of a new department, the Department of Communities, is a really nice idea. But where's the money behind it? Where's the mandate? What are they doing? Is it just a make-work project for another ministry? You know, I mean, we wonder that. We want to see the connection between good government and taking responsibility and the cost to people living in this province today. And our big concern, Mr. Speaker, I know my time is running out quickly, our big concern in the Liberal caucus are the job losses across this province, people losing faith in the government, people leaving our province because they can't find work, the negativity and lack of confidence in the business climate, and all of that coming back to an uncertainty for individual employees. People not sure of their jobs, not sure of their future. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the chance to respond to that because I find it very difficult to perceive an attack on Nova Scotians when a government that has inherited a $13 billion debt and a $1.4 billion structural deficit. That's the part of the debt that sticks like chewing gum, and it's the part that you don't just stick under the desk for the next generation to inherit, which is what previous governments have done. It's really hard to perceive it. We don't want your used chewing gum. That's right. We're not going to leave it to the next generation. That's not unparliamentary, is it? Oh, all right. Okay. We're not going to leave that for the next generation. It's hard to perceive it as an attack when the same government that has inherited those debts and that has determined that it is going to get rid of that structural deficit is at the same time going forward to remove the HST on energy and to institute a $200 home heating energy rebate for low-income Nova Scotians. That's the part. That's right. That's the part that allows them. That's the part that allows them to stay in homes.
Order. Order, please. The member from Halifax Atlantic has the floor.
Okay. All right, has instituted that home heating rebate. That's the part that allows low-income Nova Scotians to actually keep the roof over their head. That's the part that allows low-income Nova Scotians to keep the energy account without which they're not otherwise going to be able to keep the lease. This is the same government that has raised the basic personal tax exemption, has raised the Nova Scotia child tax benefit by 22% per child per month. This is the government that has added 250 new child care spaces, allowing 250 more families to work, to earn livings. This is the same government that is enabling those working people who unfortunately still find themselves reliant on income assistance because of the paucity of their wages to keep more of that income. And this is the government that is working to stabilize costs in an ever more volatile global economy. I've always been curious that 2008, that was a year that was predicted to be the year of peak oil, somehow turned out to be the first phase of a recession that we don't necessarily know for sure is over. When we look at the global economies around us, it doesn't seem any too certain that the rest of them have been able to eliminate their structural deficits and that the decisions that they have undertaken in the face of heavily energy-dependent economies are actually going to be decisions that they're able to follow through with. Some are in much, much worse shape than we are. Fossil fuels have become the lifeblood of our society, and fossil fuels are going to be more and more and more volatile. And this is the government which, in our own way, is doing its best to stabilize those costs. This is a government which is working to reduce dependence on gasoline, which is working to improve alternative transportation on public transit. It's a government which, and I'm sorry I have to look this, is working not only to stabilize those costs, but also to reduce the dependency on the transportation modes. I remember being a resident of Nova Scotia in the same year that HST was introduced, that free trade was introduced, that municipal amalgamation was introduced, and these were crippling. These were absolutely crippling. And this was the same time when electricity costs began to skyrocket, and I was not the only Nova Scotian who suffered under those. Transportation costs have, as the Liberal government says, become a larger part of our lives than ever, and we are working to mitigate that. The withdrawal of services from rural Nova Scotia that began with municipal amalgamation under the Liberal government as huge municipal zoning entities determine where workplaces, health services, entertainment venues, residential areas will be permitted. That has made us ever more dependent on those fossil fuels for transportation, because when you can't walk to those places, somebody's got to take you there. And if it's not safe to ride a bike or walk, somebody's going to take you there. And as it stands at this point, that's going to be a fossil fuel dependent entity. And if those entities don't invest in services or public transit in a given area, it's a choice of winners and losers. And they're winners and losers on the large scale. Those are decisions that were set in place some 10 to 12 years ago, and we are working to do what we can to counterbalance those. I see this as a government which is working to stabilize not only transportation costs and the dependence on transportation, but in fact, municipal property taxes, those which have become an ever larger property tax assessments, which skyrocketed after municipal amalgamation, are a bigger and bigger part of the property tax burden on that one taxpayer that we always talk about. This government has kept a tax on property tax assessments, and that helps not only homeowners but tenants, because it means that at least the cost of living increase and inflation increases are some kind of a stricture on otherwise unlimited assessments. And when Nova Scotia Power was privatized in 1992, it wasn't under an NDP government. And when it was reorganized in 1998 into the entity that we now know as Emera, a multinational, in fact, based in Nova Scotia, it wasn't under an NDP government. And we talk of the NDP, everybody talks about a monopoly, and the leader of the opposition talks about a monopoly, and he says it's time to break it. And I wouldn't be presumed to speak on that, but I can say that that monopoly was not created under the NDP, and the transmission grid was not locked into private hands under this government. But it's this government which has mandated the most aggressive renewable energy targets in the world. And renewable means renewable. There isn't peak wind, and there isn't a day so far when we see the tides drying up. But it takes money, and it takes energy, and it takes imagination, and the kinds of energy and imagination that we are putting into a creative economy, that we are putting into our universities and research institutions, that's the kind of money that it takes up front to put forward a stable future for Nova Scotians. And that's the kind of future that all Nova Scotians can benefit by. I like to think of rural economic development as rural stabilization as well. And we're working to stabilize rural Nova Scotia, which has been decimated in previous years. We're looking at instituting collaborative emergency centers in communities where hospitals have been closed. We're working to develop a formula which will protect small and isolated schools, which will allow people to have the kind of an education which has sent Nova Scotians forward as creative, energy-giving people around the world for hundreds of years, and which we expect will continue to do this. No, there's not a short-term solution to this, but it's going to take quite a long time to get rid of that structural deficit. And it's not just a financial deficit. It is, in fact, a deficit of imagination, and it is a deficit of the autonomy which people need to make the use of the energy that is at their own hands. And it's short-sighted and narrow-minded to say that these are the only things which cost right now. Because if we're going to tax imagination, and if we are going to tax Nova Scotians out of their ability to make the best use not only of their their own educations, their children's futures, then we will have done far, far more damage than has been done in years past. But we're not going to do that, Mr. Speaker, and I believe that we are not taxing Nova Scotians into submission. It may have happened in the past, but we hope that we are setting them free. Thank you.
There you go.
The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the honourable member talking about chewing gum. That's a gum that's cost everybody in Nova Scotia 2% more since this government came into office. And they talk about re-chewing the bubble gum. Well, Mr. Speaker, most families today have to re-chew that bubble gum in order to make it worth their while to buy. That's what we're debating here today. Mr. Speaker, the NDP love to stand in the House and pretend they are working for the people of Nova Scotia. I believe that the slogan I hear was a better deal for today's families. Well, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians don't feel like they're working for them. They feel like they're being taxed to death, and they don't feel like they're getting the bang for their buck. More tax on most things they buy and use today. They feel the healthcare system is getting harder to access. I know in my own riding, in 2010, 1,700 hours of emergency room closure. Mr. Speaker, that's 2.5 months if you total it all up. We heard today of the dialysis unit in Hants West. They worry about our education system and how the cuts will affect our children and our grandchildren and how it will affect our future of this province. They worry about jobs and will we have one for our children and our grandchildren and for future generations. Will they be able to survive and remain in this province to earn a living and to raise a family? Mr. Speaker, they worry about economic development and our small towns being able to sustain themselves. Will the increased taxes and the decreased payments to areas of the province in rural Nova Scotia, they're starting to suffer. Now, with first contract arbitration, employers and employees throughout the province are concerned. We're hearing it in our law amendments. They're concerned about how it will affect their business and how it will affect their jobs. Will it kill jobs in Nova Scotia? Why are we pushing this through? Why now, when there has been no labour unrest in the province? We've heard about the stats over the last number of years. There's no reason to go through them again. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, they're also not working for our seniors. Seniors are facing a harsh reality when it comes to access to long-term care beds. There are 1,700 seniors in Nova Scotia waiting for access to long-term care beds. And a report last week told us that there was over a 400-day wait for seniors in long-term care beds in Cape Breton. And that waiting list is growing. It's not getting any shorter. It's unfortunate for all those waiting that this government has cancelled a program that was creating more beds. It was supposed to create 1,320 beds. The previous government had a long-term care strategy, but this government cut it short by 200 beds. It's been said that Nova Scotia wait lists have grown 35.5% from April of 2010. That's just unacceptable, and the blame rests at the feet of this government. And it's not just the seniors. It's all working Nova Scotians. Those Nova Scotians that go to work every day, those that are fortunate enough to have a job, those who pay taxes, and those who've helped fund the province. There have been 5,400 fewer full-time jobs in Nova Scotia since the NDP took office. In the same time frame, 8,400 people have just given up and left the workforce. They either left the workforce or they left the province. This government is promising jobs here. What rural Nova Scotians are asking, jobs where? Where are the jobs in rural Nova Scotia? They're not in Cape Breton, they're not in Yarmouth, and they're not in Nova Scotia. It's rural Nova Scotians that are feeling negative impact of this government's bad policies the most. Cape Breton is down 2,100 jobs. The North Shore is down 1,400 jobs. Annapolis Valley is down 600 jobs. And southern Nova Scotia is down 2,500 jobs. That's a total of 6,600 jobs, Mr. Speaker. The government keeps trying to sweep this information under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist. But it does. We all know, especially us who live in rural Nova Scotia, that it does exist. Ask the former Yarmouth Ferry employees. Ask the former New Page employees, Signature Styles, and the list can go on and on. Last week in the House, the Minister had the nerve to state that we're going to stand by the strategy and we will let it wind its way through and continue to create good jobs, good opportunities for Nova Scotians in every region of the province. Every region of the province, but what we just stated. Halifax has grown, and rightfully so. It's the capital of the province. But rural Nova Scotia is suffering. No one else believes that propaganda but the Minister and the Premier and the government. Last week, this government was asked directly, what are you going to do about the job loss crisis in rural Nova Scotia? The answer, they didn't believe there was a crisis in rural Nova Scotia. The Premier says he just agrees that there is a crisis, but people in rural Nova Scotia are faced with it. They live it every day. No jobs. And with the passage of time, it seems like it's going to get worse. Time is not on their side, Mr. Speaker. Hope is fading for lots of rural people in rural Nova Scotia. This government is out of touch with reality. The reality that we all face every day, such as higher taxes, 2% since they went in and took office, and we're told today that they promised they wouldn't raise taxes. And the Premier said that he didn't make that promise. Higher user fees. $1,400 to be exact. Everything from licenses, driver's licenses, to trailer licenses, to fishing licenses. Their bite the bullet electricity plan. Not that we're not for greener energy, Mr. Speaker. Our government introduced green energy, but the targets have rose. The cost of the taxpayer is being passed on these higher energy costs. And most recently, their misguided approach to labor laws. Bill 102 has not went over well with small businesses in rural Nova Scotia. And we've also heard from people in urban Nova Scotia that own small businesses that this is not going over well. These are a couple of more issues that illustrate how the government is not working for Nova Scotians. All of those combine to make Nova Scotia uncompetitive. They're job killers. We're hearing it all over Nova Scotia, from all aspects of life, from big business to small business. I have spoke with some of them myself. The effects are being felt from Yarmouth to Sydney. Businesses are struggling. They're struggling to stay competitive. They're struggling to stay open. They're struggling to keep their employees. The NDP government is refusing to acknowledge that high taxes, higher user fees, higher power rates, and job-killing labor laws are negatively impacting Nova Scotians. So let's just recap, Mr. Speaker. We're leading in all the wrong way. Leading the country in high taxes, leading the country in higher power rates, and now we're leading the country in the cost of living. Nova Scotia's consumer price index is a full percentage point above the Canadian average. It's getting harder and harder for Nova Scotia families. Wages have not kept up with these rising costs. They have a 0% growth in the past year. The NDP seem like they're just not on the side of families and jobs. As I pointed out earlier today, there are 5,400 full-time jobs in Nova Scotia lost since the NDP took office. Bit by bit, the policies and the direction of this government are killing our economy. Instead of trying to fix the problems that Nova Scotia doesn't have, they're doing this with first contract arbitration. The NDP government should focus on the declining standard of living occurring under their watch. A job puts food on the table, puts your kids through school, and hopefully puts a little bit extra money in your pocket. The members opposite are looking a little skeptical. I even hear a little giggling. But they only ask their colleagues to sit in the Law Amendments Committee. The last few days have seen businesses after business plead their case that FCA is going to hurt them. Not only their ability to employ Nova Scotians, but to compete globally. They also state that it will hurt the possibility of new business setting up in the area. It'll cause them to set up in areas like PEI and New Brunswick, and maybe even go to Maine. On top of their misguided labor legislation, we're the highest tax jurisdiction in the country. That plays a massive role in job losses. The NDP's higher HST has resulted in higher costs for families and employers. And as I stated earlier, the NDP's job destruction path doesn't leave any corner unturned. It starts at one end of Nova Scotia and carries all the way through the other. Because of the NDP, Nova Scotians from Cape Breton to Yarmouth and everywhere in between are struggling more and more to make ends meet. And Mr. Speaker, you have a responsibility to make things better for Nova Scotia, to create jobs, not to destroy them, but they are failing. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the honourable member for Kings West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and pleased this evening to join the debate on Resolution 1857. I always like to put the debate in context, and I know several speakers now have addressed the resolution, but the resolution went something like this: whereas Nova Scotians are paying more taxes every day thanks to the decisions of the NDP government, whereas Nova Scotians are paying higher and higher power bills, paying more at the pump every day, and the third area, of course, is more taxes as a result, of course, of the HST. So that's the context and the basic premise of the resolution that we have before us today. I think also, just to point out a couple of things the member opposite had to say when the member talks about stabilizing rural Nova Scotia. Well, I think if government, when this House breaks and decides to travel rural Nova Scotia in January and February, they're going to see a tough reality that is upon us here in Nova Scotia. There is no stabilization going on. We continue to bleed jobs in rural Nova Scotia. Maybe in the new year, there will be some bright spots of mills, reopening. It's a possibility, and perhaps we may see other businesses that will take on expansion. But at the current time, there is no sign of stabilization. There was a job posted in Digby last week, a job in Digby, a minimum wage job, being a part-time receptionist in a massage therapist's office. 71 people applied. Places like Digby have been devastated since the closing of Convergys. And again, the impact that we've seen on small businesses as a result of the changes in southwestern Nova Scotia. The member, I want an explanation, and maybe the member opposite will send me a little note about how her government is working to improve greater amounts of public transit. Because just last week, Metro Transit said their ridership is down. They're looking at ways to increase ridership and help get some of the congestion off the streets of HRM. So, where is the program? Where is the program that will assist them? The reality is that right now we have greater congestion going on in HRM. So maybe there's a new program going to be announced in 2012. I look forward to seeing people using public transit, because I know in my part of Nova Scotia, King's Transit has been a leader in many ways. And people are being taxed to the point of hurting in this province. And the reality is that in July of 2009, which was really the first full month of the NDP government, and these are not guesstimate or estimate statistics, these are the real statistics. In July of 2009, 900 Nova Scotians were employed, gainfully employed in this province. As of the end of October 2011, 449,400 Nova Scotians were employed in this province.
I would ask the honourable member to table that document when he's finished reading it, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly will. And just to add to that, the labour force having contracted by 14,800, because on taking office, there were 506,400 Nova Scotians available to be in the workforce, and the most recent numbers, 491,600 Nova Scotians available to be in the workforce. So we have those numbers, which I know are very discomforting, very unsettling for government, but it's the people who face and work and have to live with these realities every day that I think we all need to be coming to this House to take part in real debate and work on a consensus of ideas on how to move the province forward, not bring in a bill like 102. I'd like to see real debate on how we can improve the well-being of more and more Nova Scotians. And, in just 2 years, from 2009 to 2011, on January 1st, when the price of electricity goes up by 10%, it's going to be at least 10%. It's broken down by 6.1% announcement yesterday.
Order, please. The chatter is getting a little bit high, so if there's conversations you'd like to take outside, that'd be fine. The Honourable Member for Kings West has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And 3.2% from the fuel adjustment mechanism, and then the carryover from last year to distribution of an increase over the 3-year period with the I guess what we've now been calling, while it is the Efficiency Nova Scotia tax added on to the electric bill, will bring us over 10%. So we're getting very close to 20% increase in electrical rates in just 2 years, and Nova Scotians are really feeling that and impacting again on making decisions about keeping the lights on, keeping the heat in their home, and having to make choices around food, medication, clothes for children, all these kinds of areas. And it's little comfort that as these prices increase, those that live in poverty from day to day, again, a reality that we were reminded of in this House with a small protest outside Province House today. And I think what many of us find the most troubling is, of course, hearing of 14,000 youth in our province that live each day of their lives below the poverty line. And those of us who have had those children in front of us in a classroom know their struggles with learning. We know how they're affected. And we know that schools and the communities have jumped in to help out with at least one nutritious meal a day. The face of the power rates, the food increases, I thought for sure that with what the NDP had said in opposition around the tax on gasoline, and now moving the setting of rates over to the UARB, which is costing us more than when Service Nova Scotia handled this. These are areas that they're small amounts, but they trickle down, because we know the cost of gasoline and diesel also is pervasive throughout the province. That is added on when our food providers bring food into the province, distribution costs, all of these costs are added on. And that food basket the nutritious food basket is becoming very, very costly. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, to wrap up, I know all of us as MLAs as well, we know the use of food banks in our areas, or many of us have some idea, and again, they're at an extremely high rate, and those are the face of the hurt in this province that I believe is the face of the affordability crisis, and jobs are going to be the answer, and we can all hope and work for a day when more and more Nova Scotians are able to head to work. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
Thank you, and I want to thank all honourable members for their participation in the debate today. The chair will now recognize the Honourable Acting Government House Leader, the member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that concludes government business for today. After daily routine tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, and question period, we will be calling bills for second reading. Bill number 118, 120, 121, and 122. We will also be calling host for committee on the whole house on bills, Bill 72, 81, 86, 93, 94, 95, 98, 104, 108, 111, and 112. And hours will be from between the hours of 12 and 6. I do now ask that you do now rise and meet tomorrow.